Faint Hope tells the story of a monk who practiced herbal medicine. The monk was known to the villagers as Ljubarski Deda, as he lived in a place called Ljubar. Doctors were scarce in the early 1920s in Ukrainian villages, and he developed a significant reputation as a healer, I guess with varying degrees of success. He was always dressed in white, and his house was decked out with shelves packed with dried plants and herbs. My grandmother's firstborn daughter was called Justina. She was a sickly infant, and Ljubarski Deda was called upon to treat her. Seeing this child, Deda immediately said to my grandmother, "Sell me your baby," suggesting that my grandmother was still young and would have more children. She became angry at this, and Deda told her he was not a doctor and perhaps she should take this child to a doctor. Nevertheless, he gave her a packet containing dried herbs and plants, and instructed her to bathe the sick child in these herbs. Other than that, there was nothing more he could do. When my grandmother arrived home, she started to heat some water to bathe her child, unwrapped the packet of herbs and threw them in the water, only to see that each small plant floating on the water had a droplet of wax on it, making her very curious. However, it was not long after that Justina died, and my grandmother then understood that the droplets of wax were a sign of death. In this textile piece, I've used keys embedded in the fabric to represent the knowledge possessed by the monk, and the background is lavishly embroidered, depicting the hold that the church had. The middle section represents the herbs used by the monk, and finally the lower section depicts the bathwater with floating flowers. This work is called Pig Under the Table. It's not as decorative as the other two pieces. I wanted to express the religious and political turmoil in Ukraine in the early 1930s. It's a very bleak and black period in Ukraine's history. Stalin set in motion events designed to cause famine in Ukraine. An estimated 10 million people died between 1932 and 1933. Farmers were forced to give up their private lands, equipment and livestock, and were forced to join state-owned factory-like collective farms. In 1932, a decree was implemented that called for the arrest and execution of any person, even a child, found taking as little as a few stalks of wheat. All food was considered to be sacred property of state. That is, all food was sent to Russia. My mother was about 8 years of age at this time. My grandparents heard that officials were about to visit the village to conduct a check on the livestock, so they decided at great risk to hide a pig. So some of the floorboards were removed from the kitchen. A hole created, the pig was muzzled and slaughtered, and pieces wrapped in cloth and placed in the hole. Then the hole was filled in with dirt, and the floorboards replaced, and the kitchen table was then positioned over the top. Sure enough, a few days later, officials arrived to discover that not all the livestock was accounted for. A pig was missing. Questioning the villagers, they made their way to my grandparents' house and demanded to know the whereabouts of the pig. Ignorance was feigned. No one knew anything about a missing pig. However, my mother, a child, piped up, pointing to the table, said the pig is under it. My grandparents turned deadly white, knowing exactly what the consequences would be. My quick-thinking grandmother walked over to the table, picked up the tablecloth and said, "Where's the pig?" Then turned to the officials and said, "This child is so hungry she's imagining there's a pig under the table." It was a close call, but without the pig the family would have starved over the long cold winter. In this textile piece, the architectural qualities remain, but the lavish surfaces of the other two pieces, illustrating the rich iconography, and vestments are replaced by pragmatism. Soviet authorities made atheism the official doctrine of the Soviet Union, and in doing so destroyed churches, ridiculed and harassed religious leaders. Kohanivka Forest. Kohanivka is the village where my mother was born and lived until the age of 16, when war broke out. When my grandparents married, my grandfather built a new house, which happened to be across the road from the village church. The church played a very important part in village life. Consequently, the architectural qualities feature in all 3 textile pieces. However, the surface treatment varies from richly embroidered surfaces, embracing icons, to pragmatism with pig under the table. Initially, my grandfather was a wealthy landowner, which included large tracts of forested land. When my grandfather's younger 2 brothers came of age, he divided his land into 3 parts. This was a wise move, as in 1929 his decision saved him from being exiled to Siberia as a large landowner. Large parcels of land were confiscated by the state. My grandfather's older brother voluntarily gave up his land to the state and became an activist against the Bolsheviks. Kohanivka Forest played an important part in the lives of villagers. Summers were spent mushroom picking, which was, and still is, a very serious pastime, and blueberry picking. Winters were icy and very cold. My mother, as a young student, would trek through this bleak, cold landscape to and from school. Parts of this forest still remain and is still known as Adamet's Forest, which was my grandfather's forest.